it going, everybody? So as we're closing out 2024, you know what that means. Oh, the various different end of the year lists. We're starting off with the top 10 worst movies that I saw this year. I've seen over 100 plus movies this year. Like every year, there are some movies that are so bad that they are warranted to discuss, to remind you how much you enjoy all of the good films that came out this year. You can't have the good without talking about the bad. I'm sure your list is going to be different, and I want you to share your list of your top 10 worst movies down below. So without further ado, let's get into my top 10 worst movies of the year. Coming in at number 10, I have The Deliverance. Honestly, I had considered putting this far lower on the list, but it's such an entertainingly messy, bad movie that I had to put it a little bit higher. The film had stuck to one tone. It probably could have been decent. One half of the movie tries to be a very serious family drama that's centered around abuse, only to completely shift gears going off the rails into a bad exorcism movie. Once The Deliverance kicks over into that exorcism part of the story, that's when everything just kicks it into gear as far as embarrassing. You've got one of the kids eating his own poop, absolutely awful CGI, and whatever the hell Glenn Close is doing in this movie. To be honest, Glenn Close probably is the only reason I would even kind of recommend checking this out. Her dialogue alone is some of the most insane lines of dialogue from any movie that I've pretty much seen the entire year.
I can smell your nappy pussy.
Supposedly, this also is based on a true story, but nevertheless, it's just a downright bad film. Coming in at number 9, I have The Strangers Chapter 1. As somebody that really enjoys the original The Strangers, I'm still kind of baffled about this entire project. Regardless of the fact whether they'll admit it or not, it's almost beat for beat a remake, copying much of the setup, several of the different style of kills. The only issue here is that it does it in a far worse manner than the original Strangers. Essentially, The Strangers Chapter 1 strips away all of the suspense, tension, atmosphere, all of those things that makes the original Strangers iconic. And it's not helped out either by the fact that this couple probably is objectively one of the dumbest couples ever in the history of horror films. This is the first installment in a new trilogy of the Strangers films. They already filmed Chapter 2 and 3, so we do know inevitably we're going to get to see those at some point. But after this first installment laying the groundwork, if you will, I wouldn't say I'm exactly excited for it. Coming in at 8th place, I have Atlas. Part of me feels really bad because I do like Jennifer Lopez. It just seems like every single year there's one movie that she does that ends up on my worst of the year list. Stories revolving around AI, more often than not, almost ironically feel very derivative, and that's no different here with how shallow everything feels throughout this journey we go on with J-Lo's character in Atlas. If I'm being honest, I don't think J-Lo is actually all that terrible in the movie. It's pretty much everything else revolving around her that makes this movie so unwatchable. She's done no favors by the bland script and very ugly looking visuals. Streaming films every year do get a pretty bad rap, especially when they try to delve into big blockbuster style entertainment. Spoiler alert for later, this isn't the only Netflix movie on the list, but this is one of many streaming movies that we get every single year that is just downright unwatchable. Coming in at number 7, I have Night Swim, and yet another year where horror continued to really thrive in the space. Early on in January, it didn't feel like we were starting off on the right foot here with Night Swim. Obviously, a evil pool is an extremely ridiculous idea, even for the genre of horror, where there's so many other ridiculous ideas that usually end up working. I'll give Night Swim some benefit of the doubt. There's an attempt to create atmosphere for creepy visuals, but in the end, it's all incredibly underbaked scares you expect from a supernatural tinged Blumhouse production. Instead, this time, they're all relegated to a pool, so there's not very much as far as freedom to conjure up anything interesting for this family to do. Coming in 6th place, I have Imaginary. This really pains me to talk about because I am such a huge fan of horror, but it might finally be time to have that tough discussion on the downfall of Blumhouse. Not from a financial standpoint, these movies still make a ton of money for the most part, but the amount of quality movies each and every year that Blumhouse puts out now gets continuously less and less. If you look at their entire slate for 2024, almost every single one this year was pretty bad outside of arguably Speak No Evil, at least to me. Imaginary is pretty much the Blumhouse formula at almost its near worst. You've got your bland, one-dimensional characters, some of the lamest jump scares you can imagine, and the usual derivative storytelling that ironically in this case lacks a ton of imagination. Somewhere deep down in Imaginary, there's a cool idea here, yet they go down the most bland, unoriginal route you can imagine with a movie called Imaginary. Like we're talking, they actually visit an imaginary world, and it's just a bunch of random doors. To me at least, it almost felt like Blumhouse as a production studio took took the wrong lessons from Megan's success and tried their hardest to take that formula and apply that to Chauncey the Bear, doing their best to push an emphasis on Chauncey in the marketing, attempting to create another type of horror icon like they just did with Megan. The main issue here is, in a similar vein to Annabelle, this character doesn't have any sort of actual personality to latch onto. In the rare times you do see Chauncey as this monstrous teddy bear, it does look really cool. It's used so sparingly it can't make up for the fact that the majority of the movie surrounding that is just lame. But overall, it feels like to me 2024 had to be the worst year for Blumhouse as far as movies go. Coming in 5th place, I have The Crow. I almost touched upon this in Imaginary, but I don't think there's any studio that had a far worse year overall in 2024 than Lionsgate. We're talking Imaginary, The Crow, Borderlands, Megalopolis. Horrible movie after horrible movie. It was getting pretty concerning. Back to The Crow though, from the very beginning, remaking The Crow is not something I imagine many people wanted in the first place, and somehow it ended up being far worse than I could have ever imagined it to be. In a similar vein to The Strangers Chapter 1, it feels like all the personality and style was stripped from this interpretation, and nothing exciting is injected in its place. Bill Skarsgård is trying his best with the very bad material that's given to him, but the narrative around him is uber generic. There is zero chemistry or spark to the love story that fuels this revenge tale. With no spark whatsoever, there's no incentive to get behind watching this journey unfold. Not helped out at all by the fact that he doesn't even become the Crow until the last 30 minutes or so of the movie. That in of itself is terrible, but it's not helped out at all by the fact that the Crow attire in this just looks really bad. I'm honestly baffled at the redesign. The new version of the Crow just feels very empty and soulless even, and tries to update a story that really has no reason to be touched ever again. Coming in 4th place, I have Megalopolis. I was a little bit late to the party watching Megalopolis. I waited until it actually hit VOD. This was one I just did not want to go see in theaters. What a delightful, absurd mess Francis Ford Coppola's latest film ended up being once I tuned in. From top to bottom, almost every single aspect of Megalopolis is an all-around bewildering disaster. A completely incomprehensible plot where most of the star-studded cast almost feels like they're all in completely different movies and given some of the funniest cringy dialogue all of this year. As a film experience, it's completely mind-numbing, filled with subplots that lead nowhere, jumbled themes of time, civilization, and legacy that never tries to form anything cohesive by the end of the film. I do commend Francis Ford Coppola for funding this movie himself, but ultimately I don't really know if this was worth it in the end, but more power to him for getting it out there, I guess. Coming in 3rd place, I have Uglies. I really tried to give Uglies a chance. I grew up during that era where there were so many YA adaptations that I did enjoy to various degrees, like your Divergent, stuff like that, but ultimately, once I watched this on Netflix, it was just complete pure cringe. The premise alone is bad, already negated by the fact that you cast all these very attractive people as quote-unquote ugly people. Then you just crank up these crazy filters to make them considered pretty. Maybe the book that Uglies is based on is a whole lot better at fleshing out the overall premise and these characters, but this film adaptation is rough. The dialogue, poorly executed attempts at action, and McG's direction all around just does this movie no favors. By the way, did you know that McG directed this? I knew that McG had directed a couple different Netflix movies over the years, particularly the Babysitter films, but it seems like if you look at his filmography, he has been stuck in the Netflix dungeon for so many years now, and hopefully after watching Uglies, they free him. I think he needs to do something else with his time. In my runner-up spot, I have Madam Web. This year alone in 2024, we had 3 different Sony Marvel movies in this Spider-Man universe they're trying to do that has all these different villains in it, but Spider-Man never shows up. Sony had gotten away with this to a degree before, even if some of the movies weren't necessarily good, with the Venom films, Morbius. Madam Web, however, felt like the true beginning of the end for this Sony Spider-Man universe. Much of Madam Web feels poorly cobbled together, especially in the narrative for Cassandra Webb, her various different powers, and the multitude of hilariously bad ADR Ezekiel Sims has throughout the movie. I realized later on, once you watch Madam Web, and then also Kraven the Hunter, and even maybe a little bit of Venom, for some reason, the ADR in all of these movies is just downright terrible.
But in the future, less than nothing. I will not give up.
I don't know who the ADR person is for Sony, but I don't know how they have a job after these movies. Somewhere inside of Madame Web, there is an interesting idea, because essentially at its core, Madame Web is basically Spider-Man meets the Terminator, because Cassandra Webb is protecting these 3 girls from Ezekiel Sims who are all going to inevitably grow up to become Spider-Women. The major issue here is that I do not care about any of these characters. Nobody in this movie has any personality to speak of. I could not care less about any of them or these girls going on to become Spider-Women and take out Ezekiel Sims. Not helped at all by the fact that this movie completely blue balls you into thinking they're going to actually transform into Spider-Women at some point by the end, have a big battle. It is a superhero movie after all. All those different sequences are stuff that happens in the far future, not even in this movie whatsoever. It's laughably embarrassing, on top of the fact there are so many other parts in this that made me laugh out loud on how stupid it was. The wild people that we see Cassandra interact with in the Amazon that look like spider people, which is made all the more ridiculous by the fact that she travels to the Amazon in the very middle of the movie and then comes back. And the best detail of all is the main villain in the movie gets killed by product placement, getting crushed by a Pepsi sign. I even drunk a Pepsi today thanks to Madame Web, so shout out to Madame Web, because this is why I'm drinking Pepsi today. Before I go into my number 1 pick for the worst movie I saw all of 2024, I do have a handful of dishonorable mentions that I definitely need to talk about. Those being Back to Black, Dear Santa, Tarot, Unfrosted, Kraven the Hunter, and also Harold and the Purple Crayon. I almost considered watching that Megamind movie that Peacock put out that was just completely downright terrible, supposedly. That would have definitely probably been number 1, or at least in the top 3. But that movie seems so easy to put at number 1 that I didn't want to just watch it for the sake of adding it to the list. But coming in at number 1, I have Borderlands. In a year that's been pretty bad for Lionsgate all around, this is kind of the crown jewel out of the terrible year they've had. Not only is this my least favorite film of the entire year, it's definitely down there as far as the top 10 worst video game movies I've ever seen. It's a rare example, especially in modern times, where a video game adaptation gets pretty much everything wrong. James Gunn honestly should get some type of residuals from how much Borderlands attempts to recreate his style of writing and filmmaking with far less success. Most of the story in Borderlands is a generic run-of-the-mill fetch quest with bland action and visuals, and all around was just a complete chore to sit through. I'm still kind of baffled that for the most part they got every single character wrong as far as casting their live action counterpart. Ariana Greenblatt as Tina is kind of the only one I would give some grace to. Everyone else though was kind of a miss. Kevin Hart as Roland is completely nothing like his game counterpart. Jack Black, I will admit, got a laugh out of me once or twice, but he did kind of start to overstay his welcome the longer he was on screen. Jamie Lee Curtis and Cate Blanchett are 2 actresses I adore the majority of the time. I don't understand why they're playing these characters. They are far too old to be playing Tannis and Lilith. Outside of that, nothing about their performances feels anything like the characters from the video game. In this day and age where it seems like we were finally back on track with video game adaptations being pretty good after so long, they pretty much were just always downright terrible. Borderlands kind of reminds you of how good we have it now compared to back in the day. So hopefully, especially with this movie completely bombing at the box office, we can just move on, bury this and leave it in 2024 and not think about Borderlands as a movie ever again. And there you have it. That is my top 10 worst movies of 2024. It's always fun talking about movies with you guys on the channel, even if this list in particular it is talking about bad movies. I am currently working on my best movies of 2024 list. That one might take a little bit longer because I still have to catch up on a couple different movies, and then I'll narrow it down to my top 10. But make sure you share your rankings down below. Like I said before, what are your top 10 worst movies that you saw in 2024? Make sure you leave a like on the video and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you update reviews, reactions, unboxings, and more. For the next time, see you guys later.